I was having a lecture and I used the term terrorist state. The reference was to United States, and obviously a lot of people, they took a very serious offense. Let's confront a question that many in polite societies prefer to sidestep. Can the United States, a nation that endlessly proclaim itself as the world's moral leader, be considered a terrorist state? And listen, hear me out. I have an argument. For decades, American politicians and commentators have thrown around the word terrorist with impunity, denouncing everyone from armed insurgents to political opponents abroad, of course, as existential threats to freedom and democracy. The assumption is always that terrorism is what non-state actors do, and that we, the civilized West, engaged only in legitimate warfare, liberation, or, to put it politely, peacekeeping. But look closely, and the pictures become far murkier, far more murkier when you look at it very closely. When we hold US actions up against the commonly accepted definition of terrorism, which is the deliberate use or threat of violence against civilians to achieve political or ideological goals, many American foreign policy maneuvers start looking alarmingly like what we claim to abhor. Let's shatter the false distinction between terrorism as non-state crime and intervention as a state privilege. Terrorism, stripped of all spin, is about instilling fear among civilian population to sway political outcomes. If we say it's terrorism when an insurgent group bombs a marketplace to make a political point, why wouldn't we use the same term when a government flush with military hardware and intelligence capabilities bomb a village to pursue or to pressure a foreign regime or populace into compliance? The United States, and let's be honest here, has often done just that, as academics and legal scholars have argued for decades. States can and do commit terrorist acts. The notion that terrorism is an exclusively non-state phenomenon is convenient dodge, not a principled stance. Now, start with the Cold War era, coups and covert operations, Iran 1953, I think, Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973. These weren't minor adjustments to foreign policies. These were CIA-backed interventions that toppled democratically elected leaders, installing brutal regimes infamous for torturing and terrorizing their own citizens. No, the US didn't always pull the trigger directly, of course, but it set the stage, provided the weaponry, and cheered from the sidelines, of course, knowing full well that innocents would suffer to maintain American geopolitical advantage. Is that not the very essence of terrorism? Using fear and violence by proxy or otherwise to bend governments and populations to your will. Then look at the dirty wars in Latin America throughout the 1980s. The Reagan administration backed the Nicaraguan Contras, who were, let's face it, not freedom fighter, but insurgents who raped, tortured, and slaughtered civilians to destabilize a leftist government. We have collectively gasped at acts of barbarism by non-state groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but the Contras were lauded by American officials as moral equivalent of our founding fathers. Yes, moral equivalent of our founding fathers. The message was loud and clear. If the violence serves US interest, the moral rules can be compromised or are negotiable. Then fast forward to more recent era of the drone warfare in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia and beyond. American drones have rained down missiles that have blown up weddings, funerals and family gatherings. Report after report from groups like Amnesty International and the Bureau of Investigation Journalism detail these strikes. Civilian toll, families shattered, children incinerated, communities living up in perpetual fear of sudden, invisible death from above. And I'm not trying to mince the words. Terrorism thrives on fear, on unpredictability, on making civilians wonder if they are next. If that describes how drones have made life on the ground in certain regions, how is this not the very least terroristic in effect, if not a deliberate intent? Predictably, you will hear from the defenders of American establishment. They respond with well-worn excuse, but we are fighting terrorists. As if that single magic word cleans all the sins. We don't intend to kill civilians. It's collateral damage. And I want to examine this logic from everybody who try to defend this savagery. If a non-state actor kills civilian in pursuit of a political goal, it's terrorism. If the United States kills civilian while pursuing political goals, toppling a regime, forcing a foreign government's hand, it's just an unfortunate accident, a regrettable side effect. But why this double standard? Intent matters, they will argue. Yet, you'd have to be willfully blind not to see that in many of these operations, the risk of civilian death is known, predictable, and often downplayed or dismissed as the cost of doing business. You'll also hear that state actions are legal because they have congressional approval or come under the vogue umbrella of self-defense. Legality, however, is not morality. Apartheid South Africa had plenty of laws. Legality can be engineered to suit the powerful. The international legal framework, while noble in theory, often bends under US pressure. Legality becomes a shield to hide behind, and it's not a moral compass. The academic and moral reckoning scholars like Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman have long pointed out that if you apply the definition of terrorism consistently, then the United States, through various administrations, are engaged in form of state terrorism. And they are not alone. Even those not traditionally aligned with the left have wrestled with the glaring contradictions in the US foreign policy. The facts are not in dispute. The US has, on numerous occasions, supported violent actors who target civilians, conducted military operations that predictably endangered non-combatants, and systematically worked to instill fear for political ends. If that doesn't mean the threshold for terrorism, then one must wonder what does. This is ultimately a challenge to American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States is somehow above the rules it sets for everyone else. It's about peeling back the layers of sanitizing rhetoric and confronting the brutal consequences of American power on the ground in foreign countries. The question is not whether the US sometimes acts in a moral way. Of course it does. And at times it has genuinely attempted to help stabilize region and combat genuine threats. The point is that good deeds do not erase the bad. Do they justify a moral blind spot as wide as Atlantic? So, is the United States a terrorist state? By the standard definition of terrorism, using violence, especially against civilians, to achieve political aims, it certainly has engaged in actions that fit the bill. We can play semantic games and couch it in euphemism like foreign policy, strategic deterrence, or counterinsurgency. But at the end of the day, if the shoe fits, wear it. Recognizing this truth is uncomfortable, even jeering, but it's a necessary step if we ever hope to hold powerful nations accountable to the same moral and legal standards that we impose on other nations. I wanted to talk about their support of Israel, but I think the video is getting too long.